There's a window in your face, and most of us haven't opened it fully in years. Not a metaphor, an anatomical fact. The eyelid at rest, at the position it holds right now as you read this or watch this, is broadcasting a signal to your brain about what your face is supposed to be doing. And that signal has been changing, gradually, for most adults past 40, in a direction that looks very much like a slow dimming of lights nobody ordered dimmed. The time pressure is real. Not because something dramatic happens at 45 or 55, because the brain is plastic, which means it learns, which means every hour your face holds a particular resting position, the brain is practicing holding that position. It is, right now, taking notes. The question isn't whether you're training your face. You are. The question is what you've been training it to do, and whether you'd choose that if you understood the mechanism. Here is the mechanism, and it starts closer to the top of your skull than you probably expect. The levator palpebrae superioris, the muscle that lifts your eyelid, is not isolated from the rest of your face. It sits at the top of a functional hierarchy that includes the frontalis, which governs your forehead, the orbicularis oculi, which rings your eye, and through a feedback pathway that runs through the facial nerve's zygomatic branch, it communicates with the muscles that lift your midface. When the levator's resting tone is high, the signal going down this hierarchy says, alert, organized, present. When the levator's resting tone is chronically suppressed, which is what happens after years of habitual low-grade squinting under screens, under flat office lighting, under the specific kind of fatigue that doesn't feel like fatigue because it never quite resolves, the signal changes. The face below starts taking cues from a quieter source. And quiet, in this system, looks like descent. That's the first pass. Let's hold it lightly for now, because the history of this observation goes back much further than modern neuroscience, and that history is worth spending time with before we go deeper into the anatomy. The oldest evidence we have for deliberate eyelid work isn't clinical, it's theatrical. No theater in feudal Japan, the form that emerged roughly in the 14th century under the influence of Zeami Motokyo, demanded a training practice that seems strange until you understand what the performers were trying to achieve. No masks are fixed. The performer's own eyes are often the only live, visible element of the face. And no masters spent years developing what they called the art of the inner face, which, when you read their technical manuals with a modern anatomist's eye, turns out to be a training program for sustained, intentional, high-tone levator engagement. Not wide-eyed surprise. Something more specific. A quality of readiness in the upper face that communicated control, intelligence, and presence without any movement at all. These musicians and actors were doing something with their eyelids for reasons they understood in the language of performance. What they didn't have was the vocabulary to explain why it worked beyond the performance. We do now, and the two accounts agree more than they disagree. Consider how muscles don't fatigue. No, that's not quite right. They habituate. A muscle held in chronic partial contraction stops registering as contracted. The nervous system adapts to it as neutral. The levator in someone who squints for 6 hours a day at a screen is not tired. It is recalibrated. The brain has moved the baseline. And the baseline is what the downstream muscles take their resting instructions from. Medieval guild painters in Northern Europe, the ones who spent their careers bent over panels in low workshop light, show something interesting in their self-portraits across time. The early self-portraits, made in their 20s and 30s, tend to show full, open upper eyelids. The later portraits, made in their 50s and 60s, almost universally show a specific narrowing. Not age, not drooping in the surgical sense, but a settled, habituated partial closure that the painters themselves seem to have been unaware of. Jan van Eyck painted himself twice. The difference in upper eyelid position between the two portraits correlates almost exactly with the decades of close focus squinting in between. The face learns, and then it forgets that it learned. Now we go deeper. Because the argument you're most likely forming, the one about collagen loss, about gravitational effects on skin, about the purely structural explanation for what changes in the face over decades, that argument isn't wrong. Collagen degrades, adipose pockets shift. These are real, measurable changes, and they happen to everyone. The challenge is that this explanation, true as it is, misses something the pure structural model cannot account for. Low-tone tissue loses structural integrity faster than high-tone tissue. This is not controversial in musculoskeletal medicine. A shoulder that hasn't been used doesn't just wait patiently. It loses range, it loses density, it changes architecture. The face is not exempt from this. Collagen loss is the condition. Muscle tone is the variable that determines how quickly the loss becomes visible and in what pattern. The levator is involved. The whole upper facial motor map is involved, and that's a claim worth slowing down for because it changes the question from how do I fix the surface to what's the source of the signal that organizes the surface. This is where the nested analogy helps. Think of the face as a kitchen where someone is baking bread. The levator is the oven's temperature control, primary variable that sets the conditions for everything else. The dough can be excellent, the timing can be perfect, but if the oven's thermostat has drifted cold and nobody recalibrated it, the result degrades consistently, regardless of what else you do. Now, nested inside that, the oven is itself part of a building's electrical system, the way a single star's output regulates the temperature of every body in its orbital neighborhood. Pull the star's output down 5% and every planet in the system cools. Not dramatically, not overnight, but measurably, and increasingly so over time. The levator, when its tone drops, doesn't just affect the eyelid, it adjusts the thermostat for the whole building. Darwin, in The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, published in 1872, made an observation that his contemporaries mostly passed over because they were more interested in his other arguments. He noted that the upper face, the forehead, the brow, the upper lid, appeared to be the primary site where sustained emotional and cognitive states left structural traces. Not wrinkles in the simple sense. He described a kind of organization that distinguished faces that had spent decades in one habitual expression from faces that had spent decades in another. He was working without neuroscience, without EMG, without anything we'd recognize as anatomical precision. And yet the observation is consistent with what we now understand about long-term motor habituation in the facial system. The Victorians he was embedded with were wrong about almost everything they concluded from facial observation. But Darwin was watching something real. He just didn't have the tools to explain what he was seeing. Here's where the third pass begins, and this one gets specific. The levator palpebrae's relationship to the facial nerve's zygomatic branch means that deliberate, sustained, high-quality levator engagement activates a circuit. Not in a vague inspirational sense, in a literal, measurable, motor cortex activation sense. The motor cortex has a representation of every muscle in the face, and those representations are use-dependent. Use a muscle precisely and repeatedly, and its cortical territory stays robust. Let it drift into habitual partial use, and the cortical territory contracts. Not permanently, not irreversibly, but measurably, and with downstream consequences for how the neighboring muscles receive their resting instructions. 60 seconds of deliberate, full, controlled levator engagement. Not the eyes wide in alarm, not a theatrical exaggeration, but the specific quality of attention held open that the no masters spent years developing provides enough input to that cortical territory to begin reestablishing a more robust resting signal. The 60 seconds isn't the protocol. The 60 seconds is the minimum daily input required to start asking the brain a different question about what this face is supposed to be doing. The move itself is, hold on, I want to tell you what you're doing before I tell you how to do it, because this distinction matters more than the mechanics. You are not stretching a muscle. you are not exercising a muscle. You are sending a deliberate, high-quality signal to a part of the motor cortex that has been receiving increasingly quiet signals for years. And you're doing it consistently enough that the brain has reason to update its default. That's the operation. Everything else follows from understanding that. The exploratory protocol is not a prescription. It's a self-experiment. And I want you to run it honestly, meaning track what you notice, be specific, and don't assume the result you want to find. Here's the design. For 7 days, once each morning, ideally after washing your face, when your skin is neutral and there's nothing on it, you hold the levator engagement for 60 seconds. Not a dramatic pull, not squeezing the eyes. The specific action is a quality of lifted alertness in the upper eyelid, held steadily, while the rest of the face stays completely relaxed. Jaw soft, forehead not raised, cheeks passive. The engagement is at the lid only, as isolated as you can make it, for the full 60 seconds. Then you stop, go about your morning, and at the end of the day, you notice, just notice, whether the quality of your face's resting position at any point in the day felt different from your normal. Different isn't better, different is data. You're running an experiment on your own motor cortex, and the only thing you're measuring is whether the signal is changing. Days 3 and 4 are usually when it becomes interesting, not dramatic. People who do this don't typically report a visible transformation at day 3. What they report is something more like an awareness they didn't previously have. A moment in the afternoon when they catch themselves holding the eyelid at a position they don't normally hold it, and it doesn't feel effortful. That's the motor cortex updating its map. That's the oven's thermostat moving. You can ignore it, or you can notice it as the small, precise evidence that the system is responsive. 14 days will tell you more than 7. 30 days will begin to show you whether what you're doing is durable or whether it requires continued maintenance. My expectation, and I want to be careful with the language here because I'm describing a pattern, not a guarantee, is that the majority of people who do this seriously for 30 days find that the maintenance drops because the new resting signal becomes the brain's default rather than an override. The brain prefers efficiency. Once it has a clear, repeated signal, it stops averaging across the old and new versions and commits to the one it's been receiving most recently. There are people right now, in theater conservatories and in certain physical, rehabilitation contexts, doing versions of this without knowing they're doing versions of this. The acting tradition that trains the alive face, the quality of upper facial engagement that distinguishes a trained stage performer from an untrained one in the first 10 seconds of watching them, is working the levator palpebrae. The rehabilitation therapists who work with patients recovering from facial nerve palsy know that isolated levator work is one of the most effective early interventions precisely because of its downstream effects on the rest of the motor map. Neither group is doing the 60-second eyelid move. Both groups are working the same anatomy for the same reasons, in different languages with different names for what they're doing. This is a practice with a long ancestry. What's new isn't the movement. What's new is understanding why it works in terms precise enough that you can do it deliberately, without a theater master standing over you correcting your technique. The mechanism is the teacher now, and mechanisms are impervious to trends. Collagen serums come and go. The trigeminal facial feedback loop has been organizing human faces for as long as there have been human faces. The no masters didn't have the vocabulary we have, but they trained this circuit for the same reason we're discussing it. Because the upper face is where the brain announces what kind of attention it's prepared to bring to the world. And that announcement, made thousands of times daily at rest, eventually becomes structural. Everyone who looked closely enough noticed. It took a long time to explain. What else is your face doing right now that you've never directed? That's the question this practice opens. Not in a vague sense, but a concrete anatomical one, about the other motor habits your cortex has been practicing without your instruction. The eyelid was the window from the beginning, and after 60 seconds of deliberate attention, it still is. The signal starts at the lid.